you said conservation, he said efficiency. Those are two different things, so I'm just a little confused now.
Do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
If you think you got a handle on it, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll take a stab.
Well, I think maybe that's part of the reason why I emphasized the 4th, 5th, and 6th. Certainly there's the efficiency side, which I think maybe Paul is referring to. And that's mostly in reference, I think, to the manufacturing side. I think the conservation side deals a lot with residential, deals with our buildings. Right now, we expend about 70% of the electricity that we generate in our buildings. So to me, that's on the conservation side. If it's on the front end in terms of how those buildings are built, it's on the efficiency side. But you might want to add more.
Yeah. I mean, I guess to use an example of the difference between conservation and efficiency is, you know, I need to use a car to get to a hardware store where I live, and I'd like to be able to use a bike to get to a hardware store. So efficiency is making sure that the vehicle I drive is very efficient in the 5 miles or whatever I have to drive. I do so using, you know, as little fuel as possible. Conservation would be building communities where the hardware store is somewhere that's walkable or bikeable to me, and that's a far preferable option for a lot of reasons. Not only you know, saving energy, saving money, but public health and, you know, sense of community. So I think that's an example I would use in the difference between the two.
Paul, you look like you wanted to jump in.
Well, no, I mean, efficiency is all about using technology and things to do what your processes are better. And conservation is about doing less of your things so that there's more available for other stuff. You know, the famous Ronald Reagan quote about conservation being, it means I'm too cold in the winter and too warm in the summer, versus using efficiency to have a substantially more efficient air conditioner and heater, which means you can keep the same temperature you were running before. One is the conservation is substantially cheaper than the efficiency.
We have our results up here now, it looks like. So good job, Steve. So I can kind of see that. You probably can see this better than I can. It looks. 59% wind. Thank you. All right. 59% wind. What else can you see there, Steve?
10% solar.
10% solar.
13% biomass. 8% hydro. And 11% geothermal.
All right. All right. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where we are now. So right now, coal. We get 60% of our power from coal for electricity generation in the state, right?
Take a little bit.
Take a little, give or take. And we currently import all of it from other states.
Correct. I mean, when we do electricity generation in the state, if you look at all the energy that we bring into the state for traditional fuels, whether it be oil or whether it be natural gas or whether it be coal, it's the equivalent to us filling a dump truck with 10 tons of gold and having it leave the state every week. And that's the cost that we're seeing right now here in Michigan.
And so what I'm wondering is, if you look just at the cost for coal and natural gas, some people call it dirt cheap, right? When you're just looking at that alone, and I want to ask you about the other costs too. But how do these newer technologies compete with the status quo? Maybe you can start.
Okay, the economics question. Old coal is relatively cheap because you already have the capital there. You already have a lot of processes in place, and you already have the distribution system to it. And that's coming in Michigan in the 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour range. Wind, if you're in a decent wind area like West Michigan, is coming in at around 7 cents per kilowatt hour. Natural gas, somewhere between 5 and 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So solar's higher than that. And we aren't using any of the others right now for electricity. So,
I'd just like to point out that that is right for old coal, But when you're comparing potential new sources of generation like wind farms or offshore wind or something to something else, you have to compare it to new coal. And new coal is going to be substantially more expensive than old coal because you've got to build a new plant and you've got other costs.
Can you quickly define what you mean by old and new coal?
He's talking about an existing coal
I'm
plant.
talking, yeah, something that's been around for 10 years.
Yeah, the electric cost for an existing coal plant that's 20 or 30 years old. And the folks who are against renewable energy often like to compare, well, we're paying this much for coal now, and we're going to pay this much for the proposed wind farm energy, and the wind is a lot more expensive. Well, if you compare the wind farm energy that's going to come online in a couple of years to a new coal plant, which is what you'd have to build, you know, to increase the energy a like amount, you'd be paying a lot more for coal. The Public Service Commission came out with a report in February, and I believe that they pegged the price of new coal at, I'm going to get this wrong. You're talking a kilowatt hour. I'm thinking megawatt hours because that's how I read it.
Multiply by 100.
Now you're getting, yeah. But in any event, the existing wind, the contracts for existing wind that are coming online now are 25% lower than this equivalent energy of a new coal plant. And that was in February. Since February, the cost for coal, or the cost for wind has dropped substantially. We just heard some testimony at a legislative committee that I think they're coming in at 6 cents a kilowatt hour. I'm thinking $60 a megawatt hour. Is that
Yes,
right?
that would
That's
become,
equivalent.
yeah.
So it's already dropped lower than coal, and you know there are a lot of factors at work. You know, you can argue that's the low-hanging fruit. They're building the wind farms in the most advantageous places and the best wind places they can right now. So, you know, on one hand, it may get tougher to keep the prices low, but on the other hand, economies of scale and the cost of the technology is just dropping like a rock as more and more wind gets installed, and you know those forces will compete against each other. But the other thing you have to keep in mind is that once you put up a wind farm, other than the maintenance of the turbines and everything, the fuel costs are free, and they'll be free 50 years from now. Anyone want to make a guess what coal or natural gas is going to cost even 5 years from now? You know, much less, you know, when our great-grandchildren are using the same coal plant that we build in 2015, if we happen to build one. I think that's a real important point, that we know what the cost for our fuel is going to be from now forever, as opposed to having to guess whether we're going to saddle our great-grandchildren with, you know, huge cost fluctuations.
There are a couple of other critical issues. We're arguing about coal as if all other things were equal. And for one, all other things are not equal. We're also, when we're talking about, you know, wind prices, we're assuming that a windmill acts as a coal plant, and it doesn't. There's a capacity factor issue. You can't assume that you're going to be getting the rated power out of that windmill at all times. Same thing, you all know, it's pretty obvious with solar that, you know, if you have a 10 kilowatt PV array, you're not getting 10 kilowatts in the middle of the night. So I just want to make people aware that there are a couple of other subtleties that we have to develop as this conversation goes on.
Right, because generally you don't look at substituting wind for coal, you look at substituting wind for natural gas, because the natural gas is your peak loading plants. So,
Well, can you talk a little bit about how we would get to where you think we should go? Just the reality on the ground. Where do you start based on what we have, where we get our power now, and if we're going to have wind?
Well, I mean, and remember, wind can only be part of the portfolio. I'm not advocating wind power across, you know, to make up, you know, 50%, 40%. I don't even want to throw those numbers out, because then you'll say that that's what I was saying. But certainly as long as we're below 10% of your overall electricity load, wind is competitive right now, as long as you have good enough wind in your area. And what we're seeing right now is the rate of installation of wind will get us to 10% sometime in the next 10 to 15 years. Less if financial systems start to work better. One of the reasons why the price of turbines has dropped so hard is it's hard to get financing for turbines, and therefore not as many people are buying them, so there's having to have sales on turbines to drop the price. And the price per kilowatt hour of a wind turbine is heavily based on the initial price of the turbine. And so, because the O&M for wind turbine comes out to about the same, O&M operations and maintenance cost for wind turbine comes out about the same as coal per megawatt installed. So,
I'm just going to, again, I don't want to overly complicate things. Lawrence Berkeley Labs just this week came out with a really interesting report on wind. If you look at this past decade, wind prices in the first 5 or 6 years doubled, and they've gone down a third. So there are a lot of subtle reasons for why this happened. We could discuss some of them. Solar has dropped consistently over that period after there was a shortage of silicon in the world market. So we have to, if we're going to talk about a meaningful mix of renewables, we have to include solar. I mean, the rate at which solar has dropped over time relative to wind is much, much more significant. And if you look at where DOE is investing their money, DOE is investing their money on vastly reducing what we call the total integrated system costs for solar. And the same thing holds with wind, that if you're installing a wind system, at this point, you're spending nearly half the cost on non-windmill related investments.
Well, so I think something that a lot of people want to know is how much is renewable energy going to cost me in my electricity bill every month? So I don't mean to keep coming to you, Paul, but do you
Well,
want to start?
that's why I convert everything to kilowatt hours instead of leaving them in megawatts, which is what all the reports give, because people know what their kilowatt cost is. In Grand Rapids, I pay about 11 cents a kilowatt hour, and about half of that cost right now comes from getting it from the plant to my house. So if you figure that that's about 5 cents, and wind is 6 to 7 cents right now, then you're talking, I don't know, can I add that up? About 12 cents per kilowatt hour. It's between even to a little bit more expensive. Solar right now is running more expensive than that. It's running, the newest solar plants that we're putting in the Mojave are running about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. But the efficiency of solar panels is doubling very quickly. In another 5 to 10 years, solar is going to be extremely competitive. So,
And the other thing, just the other thing for people here is that it's very, very difficult to do what Paul is doing, accurately, because those costs are based upon how long is a PV panel going to last at what rated efficiency. They're also based upon, the assumptions that what we have right now in terms of the kilowatt hour cost that you pay from coal-based utilities severely underestimates the total system cost of that energy. It discounts completely the environmental costs associated with that. It discounts completely the climate change effects of that coal. It discounts completely that nearly 30% of the mercury loading in Lake Michigan is due to coal-fired power plants. And I don't know how you guys, feel about your kids and grandkids, but those are issues that we have to take very seriously. So if I'm answering Rebecca's question, I go back again to the points that you was making earlier. We need to vastly reduce how much energy we consume to provide a given unit of quality of life. And then we need to go back to what Paul was saying about efficiency. When we decide that there is something that's absolutely critical to improving our quality of life, and something that's really universalizable, something that everybody in the world could have access to, then we need to do that absolutely as efficiently as possible.